Good morning, everyone. Just to remind everyone that tomorrow, being Thanksgiving, the Mishna class will take place at 9:15, like the Sunday schedule. Okay, so we're up to Parakeh Mishnah Zayin, chapter 5, Mishnah 7. Harah and Molim, ant holes. And in these ant holes, you find grains, you find kernels of grain. The ants of these ant holes, shalonu b'tzad harema, the ant holes of ants that shalonu means they spent the night on the side of a pile achayeves, on the side of a pile that already has been set to the meiser obligation. We previously learned when it comes to gemar malacha, the completion of the processing of grain or whatever produce we're talking about, which once that processing is complete, you cannot eat from it even a snack until you separate shemus and meiseris. And here we're talking about a pile that is already set to the obligation. We previously learned that when you're dealing with a pile of grain, the completion of the processing is that after it's been all piled up, you smooth it down on all sides. The Mishna is talking about a pile that's already obligated, which means that, as we learned previously, if you don't plan on smoothing down that pile, then once the pile is made, the processing is completed. That's what we're talking about here. You have these ant holes. And these ants we saw at night were, they were at the side of this pile of grain. We didn't necessarily watch them collecting, but we saw they were there. The ant hole was there. They're there, and we find now we find kernels of grain in their ant hole. So what's the status of those grains? Now, what we have to figure, we have to set out the case here a little bit more, and that is that the only thing in this field is not just this piled up grain. There are other, grains. There are other stalks of grain that are spread all over this field that are not yet liable that are not yet set to the process. Their processing hasn't been completed. They're not yet set to the obligation of shemus and meiseris to say you can't snack from them. You've got this pile. Okay, this pile is completed. You don't do anything more to it, but you've got other stalks of grain that are spread out over the field that the processing hasn't been completed yet. They're not yet set to the obligation of shemus and meiseris. So the question now is, and there's more of that kind of grain than the pile of grain. Meaning you've got a field full of grain scattered all over. Their processing hasn't been done. There is more of that than this one pile of grain that has been completed. So our question is, what do we say when we find these kernels in the ant hole? Where do we say the grains came from? Do they come from this pile? Or do they actually come, or can we say that they actually came from the rest of the grain, which is the majority? So the Mishnah says, these grains found in the ant holes are obligated. One is obligated to separate shemus and meiseris from them before you eat. Because it is known, basically we're certain, because that from the completed thing is what they have dragged their grain from all night. The ants do their grain collecting at night. And therefore, you saw them there at night. The assumption is they're going to be going around collecting their grain at night. The question is, where did the grain come from? So the Mishnah says it's yodua, it's certain that the grain came from the completed pile, and that's where the whole night they were dragging the grain from. So what we have to understand is like this. As we said, the question here was not that this was the only pile of grain here. There were other grains here. There were other unprocessed grains here, and they were the majority. And therefore, there would have been a possibility to have said, and if we would have been in a state of doubt as to where these grains came from, did they come from the pile of completed grain? They come from the rest of the grain that wasn't completed. If we would have had a doubt, a question, then we would have said, follow the majority. That's what we would have said. Follow the majority. There's more unprocessed grain here than processed grain. So you can assume that the grains in this hole are unprocessed. You know, separate shemus and meiseris from them before you eat. But the Mishnah says that's not what's happening. in this case, where basically they were right next, we saw them next to the pile of processed grain, and therefore they've got this grain that's closer to them than the other grain, then we have no question that they went ahead and they gathered their grain from what was closer. We wouldn't say that, well, maybe they went scattering around, they kind of, they went around to the rest of the field and took from the majority. No. Being that they are right next to this, grain, this pile of grain, that's the closest thing to them, we assume, without question, we don't have a doubt, we assume that the grain came from what was closest to them, which was the processed grain, and therefore we say that the grains that are found, the kernels of grain found in the hole, came from that pile of processed grain, and therefore you cannot eat from those grains until you separate shumas and meiser. It's not even a snack. Even though the Mishna said we're talking about that they were there overnight, or we saw them there at night, the same thing would be if we saw them there by day. If we saw them there by day, that's where we saw them next to this pile of processed grain by day. The halach will be the same. The Mishnah talks about night is because that's typically when they go collecting. Okay, we are now up to the Klal Aleph Halacha Zayin, chapter 1, paragraph 7. And the previous halacha of the Chavetz Chaim was that even if a person would have to give up his livelihood, so not speak Lashon Harah, if that's how far it goes, continues the Chavetz Chaim, and from this we can know the kol shekenim nageh lo rak b'kavod ba'alma. If the only thing at issue by not speaking Lashon Harah is honor, is how people look at you. You find yourself amongst a group of people that you can't get away from. And they are speaking words that are forbidden to be said. And if he sits there quiet, not participating in the conversation, looking like he's crazy. There's got to be something wrong with him. If that's what's at stake, then it's for sure forbidden to speak Lashon Hara under those circumstances, just because it may be unpleasant for you. People may look down at you because of it. Regarding this and anything similar, where you're finding yourself in a difficult situation, our sages say, better to be called a fool your entire life, and not be considered someone evil, someone doing something evil in the eyes of God, even for 1 second. And when he finds him of that situation, he should, muster his inner strength, and he should feel assured. His reward for doing this will be never ending. Our sages teach from Tzara Agra, according to the difficulty, that's the reward. These of Avos Reb Nosson, and the Avos Reb Nosson is from the times of the Mishnah. 100 times when it's difficult, and 1 time when it's not. What that means is to perform a mitzvah or to refrain from doing something wrong that happens with difficulty. It comes with pain. It doesn't mean physical pain. It could mean physical pain. It could be emotional pain. You receive 100 times more reward for that than doing the same thing without the difficulties involved. Regarding this time, it is definitely applicable that which our sages say in the Medrash. Every second that a person keeps silent, meaning he keeps his mouth closed when he should, he will eventually receive the reward of the hidden light that no angel or creature has any fathom of what it is. Okay? And then he says how a person should deal with that kind of situation when he finds himself in a group of people that are speaking Lashon Hara? What does she do regarding, rebuking? What does she do about leaving, and if he can't leave? And all these things will be discussed later on in the Chavetz Chaim's book. Let's continue a little bit more. The prohibition of Lashon Hara applies whether you say it or you write it. Makes no difference whether the Lashon Hara is explicit, or you somehow do it in a roundabout way. Nonetheless, if you somehow or another get across the point about someone and making a negative impression, meaning you get across negative information about a person, that's Lashon Hara, whether you said it outright or you somehow or another, alluded to it, but the point got across. And one last thing, let's say you speak Lashon Hara about someone, but you say it about yourself also. I've done this, and I and he have done this wrong thing. And even if you talk about yourself negatively first, nonetheless, that doesn't exempt you from being considered a gossiper, speaking Lashon Hara, just because you're saying it about yourself also. Have a wonderful day.